Hello everyone, welcome back to RotoViz Overtime. This is a live listeners draft as we draft against 11 of our RotoViz Overtime listeners over at the FFPC in their Superflex Basketball Tournament, $35 entry tournament. Shawn, we've done one of these last week. We're in this one this week. We've drawn the 109. We had the 111 last week, so two spots further. We're getting into round one here. So as we kick things off, the draft board goes as we would expect. We have Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Justin Herbert, Kyler Murray, Joe Burrow, Jonathan Taylor, then Russell Wilson. We have the 109, Shawn, and to spoiler alert for the listeners, we went kind of zero quarterback in the last draft. We did go with Jalen Hurts here. So we take Hurts, we get our quarterback to start things off. Then it's Dak Prescott, Christian McCaffrey. We're starting to spin things around to get ready for that second round pick. So we have one more quarterback, Shawn, than we did in the previous draft at this point. How are you feeling we should let things play out here? I think the dream scenario probably for us, we get Trey Lance. Do we try? I was just going to say that, and he goes off the board. So I will share the draft board now. What's the hope here now as we move forward? Are we into the non-quarterback players at this point?
I think so. And we have three superstars left here. Hopefully one of them will fall to us, so we're not really pressed into making a different decision. Travis Kelce also would be an option. That would be the fourth play at this juncture. We know that the tight end is even a little bit more valuable in the Superflex position, where there's essentially one less starting spot because that spot goes to the second quarterback. Colm, if we hadn't done a zero QB approach to this format the first time around, I think we would have been very tempted to do it here. I also have drafted with Blair and we went zero QB, drafted with Ben and we went zero QB. So we just kind of wanted to shake things up a little bit, actually take the quarterbacks in this one, see how that build fell out. We know that the Roster Construction Explorer, you can look that up on the site, the FFPC Roster Construction Explorer, tells us that taking a couple of QBs early, QB is a nice start. Two QBs in the first four rounds is a nice start. We know that is very, very effective. If you're not going to approach it that way, then you need to have a very specific type of path, or at least a strategy that might work. And we were lucky enough last time to get Baker Mayfield very late. That was one of the reasons that we did that. He was still going to be available. We felt strongly that he was going to end up with either the Panthers or the Seahawks. That path is no longer there. He's going a lot earlier as a result of now having signed with the Panthers. And so we also have to react to changing situations. It's a different overall context now. So we have to play it that way. So we go with Jalen Hurts early. He's someone who I think has the potential to finish as the overall QB1. He's not going to be the favorite for that, but to have that shot at the beginning of the draft, I think you have to take it with what we want to do here.
Yeah, no, I agree. So we have one quarterback so far with the remaining picks after we've picked. It was Dak Prescott, Christian McCaffrey, Trey Lance, Tom Brady, Travis Kelce, and now Cooper Kupp has gone off the board. So it's a 60-second clock here. We are back on the clock. Cooper Kupp would have been an interesting option there. But we do have the option of Jamar Chase or Justin Jefferson. Quarterbacks available are Matthew Stafford, Derek Carr, Aaron Rodgers. Shawn, we've talked about this on a recent number of our podcasts that at that point we're probably moving to those elite players at their positions. We've drafted a lot of Jamar Chase this year together, not very much Justin Jefferson. I'm willing to go in whatever direction you want to go here. Are we clearly going wide receiver, or are we, there's running back options available too, but
I think it's got to be a wide receiver here. These are the two best players that are left in the draft. I think Jamar Chase is going to finish as the overall wide receiver one, but I do have a lot of him. Would definitely be fine to do a little bit of a diversification. We selected him in our last draft. Obviously, we're unlikely to get a lot of the sort of stack options that we might in a non-Superflex draft by going with either player. I think especially if you're looking at some of the big tournaments, non-Superflex, Chase is easier to play because he has more compelling week 16, week 17 types of outcomes in terms of how you can play some of the opponent's back, how you can play some of his teammates. In this draft, I think it's a little bit less of that element. It still factors in, but when you have a shot to get Jefferson at that price, I think that you want to take it. He is the player who has a little bit higher ADP. He's being drafted as though he's going to get that Cooper Kupp-ish role this year with the Vikings, and it just wouldn't ever be appropriate to say that someone is more talented than Cooper Kupp after what we saw last season. He put up one of those Antonio Brown peak types of years, one of the greatest fantasy seasons of all time. And yet it probably is the case that when you look at the overall trajectory of the two players' careers, that Justin Jefferson has broken out earlier. He scored more points earlier. He is just a freakishly elite talent. And if we were to look to 2022, as opposed to, what happened last season, we might feel fairly comfortable projecting him to score in that same range, if not more points. It'll be interesting to see how he performs over the next sort of 3-4 years together. He and Jamar Chase definitely, I think, in that range where they should be drafted in Dynasty at the same price levels as the elite quarterbacks. This is a fun two-player start.
Yeah, no, really, really fun start. We'll see how it starts to play out. Interesting, Shawn, to see if, as it progresses here. I was kind of also thinking we also have a lot of T. Higgins, but there is the opportunity that we maybe go that direction with a Justin Jefferson T. Higgins build here if things play out for us. But really like getting Jefferson in some spots. I just haven't got as much of him this year as I would like to have, but we obviously aren't big Kirk Cousins fans, but we're massive Justin Jefferson fans, so we'll see how it plays out. But the range of outcomes for him to be the wide receiver one this year is definitely there. We've seen what he's done as a rookie, as a second-year player, and if he takes another step forward this year, I'm not going to be all that surprised. I do think, Thielen is aging out. I think we're going to see him potentially have less of a role this year. KJ Osborne's there, but I'm excited to see what happens with Justin Jefferson. And with the changes in the coaching staff there, we may, coming over from the Rams, there's a possibility they start to try and get some of the ways they were getting Cooper Kupp open last year with the Rams available to Jefferson. So seeing how that plays out. The draft after our pick is Matthew Stafford goes off the board, then Jamar Chase, then Derek Carr, Stephon Diggs, Mark Andrews, Justin Fields. Then we get Kyle Pitts. We have talked about it a bit, Shawn, so I don't think we'll dive into it too much, but how are you feeling like if you're on the clock and well, let's say after we get to Stephon Diggs, maybe, how are you feeling then if you're at the back end of that round? Is it clearly Justin Fields being the target, or are you looking at some other options there? So far, we've only seen 2 running backs go off the board.
One of the cool things you can do with the tools as well is pull up the exposures and ADP in the FFPC and specifically select the Superflex tournament. So you can see how drafters have been playing it overall. You can see how they've been playing it in a time frame that you want. We're looking at a recent ADP here the last couple of weeks. We see Pitts going in the middle of the 3rd round. We see Tua and Justin Fields going in the middle of the 3rd round. DeAndre Swift selected right after them. Any of those players, especially Pitts, Fields, and Swift, if they were to fall to us, we would be ecstatic. You look at the guys who are going in that 9, 10, 11 range. You're talking about Lamb, Mixon, Lawrence wrapping back around. You have Debo and Saquon. I think that Debo, Saquon, Lamb, those types of players are going to be interesting as we approach our 3rd round pick.
Yeah, so we're just at the back end of the 2nd round now. Austin Eckler goes off the board. But Shawn, you were mentioning the tools up on rotoviz.com. But, when you can go in, I really love to go in and check that ADP grid like you mentioned there, and to be able to see exactly where players are currently going. And if we base current ADP versus what's happening in this particular draft, Pitts has gone probably 6 picks ahead, but Fields has gone, almost a round ahead of ADP. Now, Fields was somebody who I think both of us were probably hoping may have managed to slip its way back to us there. Again, we've talked about the value of the draft slot in this and where you're able to get some of the advantages. I think it's very hard, even with those early spots, Shawn, with the likes of Allen, Lamar Jackson, the Jackson Fields start that the team in 3 has is very, very enticing there. And then they move into DeAndre Swift after that. But when we're looking, it's hard to really stack up 2 quarterbacks with the profile that you want to get in those opening 2 rounds. But now that we have 1 quarterback, when are we back into not quite the 0 QB build, but are we really going to start to hold off here? Or is there anyone that could pique your interest in the 3rd round? I think we're really starting to hope for those players, that you mentioned Lamb, I mentioned Higgins, AJ Brown. Higgins and AJ Brown tend to be available in that late 4th round. But in this room that we are drafting with, they are RotoViz overtime listeners. There's usually a little bit of a emphasis then on the wide receiver position. So maybe those players will go a little bit earlier. But when we're looking outside of those guys I mentioned, I think we're probably passing up on the quarterbacks that are going to be available. Is there any running backs that are of interest now that Swift has gone?
It'd be interesting to see just how far Harris falls, because you're in this room where he is going to go far below the 211, you would think. And at that point, we would have a fairly unique build for the tournament overall. We still expect his total EP numbers to be very, very high. And then if we're wrong about him, wrong about the talent, if he does start to break a few big runs, Colin, I think I even had just a dream the other day where he broke off a couple of nice runs, and I was thinking to myself, "Oh, I mean, he's getting it
jumped
going."
Around in ADP.
Exactly. The other player here who goes at the 2-3 turn, but is likely to last a lot longer, or at least somewhat longer in our draft, would be Kirk Cousins. And that's sort of the other interesting thing in terms of putting him with Jefferson. Now, he does go at the 305, so he's not going to make it back to us. But now we're starting to move into that range where players like Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley would be interesting.
Yeah, and so we're one pick away. We're waiting for that next selection. So waiting with a little bit of bated breath, but lots of options here, Shawn, in the way that we could go. You touched on the possibility of the running backs sliding a little bit. So far we have 5 running backs off the board in this draft. That's not too far off what you would normally have. It's usually in the 7 running back range. So that is really, 2 running backs, with the 8th running back usually going off the board at our pick. So Harris does go off the board. We're back on the clock. You mentioned Harris. I think I'm interested here in maybe letting the running backs fall a little bit longer, because I think that in this room, there's going to be a lot of running back values as we move forward here. Is there a clear running back for you? Is it Barkley, or are we going to continue with some wide receivers here?
Well, one of the things I was going to point out is that Henry is about a half round below, and this early, that's still a pretty big advantage. And then if we put him with Barkley, we would have those 2 guys along with the elite players at the top. Any interest there, or do you want to go with Higgins?
Okay, I don't think we've ever drafted Derrick Henry before together, so let's just do it. Let's just break the internet completely, Shawn. Let's take the big dog there in round 3. There is a chat ongoing. Myself and Shawn aren't too active in it because obviously we're recording as we draft, but I'm sure that's going to raise some eyebrows as we draft Derrick Henry. But I do think, Shawn, looking at what we were talking about earlier, with the ADP, Derrick Henry is usually the running back 6, usually goes around the 303. We're drafting at the 309. And early in the draft, a half a round discount on Derrick Henry is interesting. And we're looking to build some unique lineups. It's going to be interesting to see how it goes. And you're talking about those unique lineups for the tournament in general. Obviously, we want to win this 12-team league, but we want to see where we can advance in the tournament. And if it's a case that he could be paired with the likes of a Saquon, and then we really start to hold off on the running back position and start drafting those wide receivers and tight ends and a second quarterback, for example, I think we could be in a quite a unique situation. Jameson Williams goes off the board to the team in the 10th slot. Derrick Henry, Shawn, I do think that has to be the first time that we've drafted Derrick Henry together. I don't know if I drafted a team last year with Derrick Henry at all, and that was looking very, very troubling halfway through the season. But yeah, Henry at that point in a team where I think they're just going to continue to use him till the wheels completely fall off. I think getting him as I'm trying to work out here what we got him as, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, still the 6th running back or 7th running back off the board. Sorry. How do you feel about that? Do you have any remorse now that Saquon Barkley's gone off the board 2 picks later?
Well, one of the things I was hoping was we'd be able to put them together here. Eric, out of the 11 slot, starts with Christian McCaffrey, Travis Kelce, Saquon Barkley. That obviously a very compelling 3-player start. Going to have to address the QB position at some point, but again, likely has a strategy for that, as we did when we passed on the QBs early. You had mentioned, is there another QB that we would draft in this range? I think that the answer to that is no. And so even though we won't be getting Baker Mayfield in the 12th or 13th, whatever it was, we're still looking at some of these guys late, right? Perhaps a Marcus Mariota. We like Jared Goff, at least to an extent. We like Daniel Jones, at least to an extent. Those guys may still go fairly early, but you're looking now at some possibilities. And the player that we drafted in the very last round of the most recent draft was Geno Smith. Colin, one of the things we could do here would be to split that a little bit with Drew Lock. Drew Lock's just not going to score hardly any points even when he plays. And so that part of it isn't as compelling even in the Superflex spot, because you're going to have some other players who could potentially outscore him and go in there. But one of the things that I was joking with Ben about on Stealing Bananas is that if the Seahawks are actually going to tank, then I have more confidence that Locke will be the QB, because he gives them much less chance to win. So if they're going for the first pick in next year's draft, he actually could be out there. And obviously, because Geno Smith is not any type of star, they'll have plenty of cover. It's not like, they're going to be accused of tanking all season long. I mean, they've been trying to build Drew Lock up all offseason. And so it wouldn't be a surprise if he starts there. Someone is going to play some snaps for the Seahawks. That's a potential route. And then kind of mixing and matching Mariota and Ritter. That part, I think, becomes interesting. Now, as we move into the fourth round here, Joe Mixon has fallen below ADP. Again, I don't think that's a surprise, because he's not someone that we tend to be on in RotoViz drafts. He goes to Eric as well, who now has selected the 3 early RB. So that'll be an interesting build to track and see how he moves from that into some other players. Trevor Lawrence, the top guy on the board. He's someone we passed on in our previous draft. Colin, what are you thinking here in terms of passing on him again? I'm imagining it would be hard for you to select Trevor Lawrence when T. Higgins is still available.
Yeah, but the other thing I just wanted to bring up here, and I know we've talked a little bit about stacking, and I know we've talked about Devontae Smith being a really strong value this season, but we would also have an option here to potentially go for AJ Brown to pair with Jalen Hurts if we wanted to open things up early like that. It would give us access to that potential stack. The other player who I'm very interested in, obviously, you said T. Higgins. My dream scenario is to get T. Higgins and AJ Brown, but we obviously took Derrick Henry. Have you a strong preference for one of them, or are you still going Higgins, who, when we passed on Chase, that was also an open door for us, and it's fallen that way if we want to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really the main reason, in addition to what we talked about, that you would go that route with Jefferson, is that you have another shot at a Bengals wide receiver who could be the overall wide receiver 1. Now, that would probably require Jamar Chase to miss some time. Obviously, we hope that doesn't happen. But T. Higgins has massive upside potential, not just for the season, but for individual games. You talk about week 17, he has that upside. I don't know that A.J. Brown has that upside as often. We've seen him have massive games, even during this stretch where, yes, he had the large target share, but the Titans didn't pass all that frequently. He had the big game that really helped Connor, for example, down the stretch of the fantasy playoffs last year when they had the comeback against the San Francisco 49ers. He may be in that mold with the Eagles more often this year. One of the things that we talked about on the recent Stealing Bananas episode about the pitfalls of projections was that every once in a while you miss on a team level with the projection, and that can really, really change where these players are going. Now, one of the things people are talking about is that potentially these wide receivers with the mobile quarterbacks are being overdrafted. I guess I agree and disagree on that. If you look at the way that the overall teams are likely to project, it's difficult to figure out how A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith can score all the points that they need to meet ADP if the offense is similar, and if Jalen Hurts is similar in terms of what his strengths and weaknesses are. Then you bring Dallas Goedert into the equation. It becomes even more difficult. You have that same problem, and maybe even in a more exaggerated fashion, because the prices are even more expensive with the San Francisco 49ers. And yet from a contingency-based perspective, I don't have nearly as much problem with it, because number one, we're talking about elite talents, and number two, injuries are going to factor in here. So you still have the potential for these guys to be massive, massive league winners. And the flip side of the fact that they're probably being overdrafted is that there are scenarios in which they're being underdrafted. And if you get a superstar who's being underdrafted, then that's how you win the whole thing. You end up with these teams that are almost unstoppable. Now, when you get to the week 17 and you're in the finals of this particular tournament, for example, or if you're the finals of the FFPC normal best ball tournament, as we were, very lucky, very fortunate to be last year, then you're competing against other elite teams. And so it's not like you're going to have this massive advantage on them. But one of the reasons why you would select a Jalen Hurts early is that he has multiple paths to victory. He can win similarly to the way he did last year. He can improve as a passer. They can be much more pass heavy, and you can draft him with or without his wide receivers. And that's not necessarily the case for a lot of the other quarterbacks. And when you have that with or without option, then I really like the way it frees you up to get good values in your drafts. And so many of these situations where we see drafters emphasizing the stack, they're losing a lot of ADP value. That doesn't mean that that can't work. I mean, sometimes I have players who are ranked multiple rounds ahead of ADP. It wouldn't necessarily make sense if I feel that strongly about them. And, obviously have evidence-based reasons to feel that strongly about them to, really try and fiddle with that last little bit and also get those guys below ADP. But that's one thing that we've talked about this year, right? Is that you do want to consider doing that, at least to an extent. It's one of the advantages of having more than one team that you do. I mean, there's just no way around it. Drafters who draft a lot are going to have the advantage of not feeling the pressure to reach for their guys, so they get better values on their guys. It was interesting, and this is kind of beyond the scope of this particular draft, but I've been doing the Dynasty workshop as well over on RotoViz, looking at the RV Triflex leagues that I did with Patrick Corain, that I'm doing with Matt Jones. Those teams very, very different, and yet even with differences in the draft spot that we got and very large differences in what we were able to do trading wise and differences in players, they both have turned out to be elite teams because you're able to take the advantage or take the edge that popped up in that particular draft. In the draft with Pat, we got the stars and we were able to get some trades to allow us to get more stars. In the draft with Matt, we got these incredible prices on 2022 rookies. And so the teams look very different, but they're both very powerful. That's what we're looking to do in these best ball drafts as well. Not necessarily force any kind of approach on it before the draft starts, but figure out as you're going dynamically what allows you to have a great draft in this particular room.
Yeah, and you mentioned with Jalen Hurts there, multiple paths to him having a successful season. What we're trying to do here is build these teams with multiple paths to success as a fantasy team, but there is a couple of quarterbacks this year, Hurts been one of them, Fields been one of them, Lamar Jackson been the other one, that I think they can have a successful season without their pass catchers having a successful season based on the rushing work I expect them to have on the ground. So, yeah, interesting. We had the opportunity for AJ Brown. He does go a couple of picks later. So we have Mike Williams, Leonard Fournette, Darren Waller, George Kittle have gone off the board. Then it is Keenan Allen, AJ Brown, Tyreek Hill, Matt Ryan paired up with Michael Pittman. And then we have Travis Etienne, DJ Moore. So it'll be interesting to see as we go through this how those bills progress, particularly the team in 111 as well, because we had the 111 in the last draft. And while we didn't go with 3 running backs in those first 4 picks, they are trying to set up that roster that maybe gives them an edge in a different way. We'll see how that plays out as the draft progresses. But looking into some of the options, Shawn, that may be there for us when we're coming back now at this next selection. Jalen Waddle still on the board. Mike Williams should still be there. Interesting, the DJ Moore pick there. He goes at the 504. He had previously been going off the board in the mid-6th round as the wide receiver 17. So obviously with the Baker Mayfield news, a little bit of a bump there. I think obviously for us, Shawn, who had been drafting Baker Mayfield in some drafts very late, hoping that he got a trade, I think obviously it's great value for us from those previous Superflex drafts. But in the case of DJ Moore, who we are very, very big fans of, are you surprised at the kind of instant bump in ADP he has received, which in this case is kind of just over a round?
Not surprised. And I do think that some bump is justified because I don't think that it was completely priced in as the Baker Mayfield move should have been priced in and wasn't, because Mayfield was going to start somewhere. At the same time, Ben and I did cover that situation in a lot of detail and really felt like the winner probably is Robbie Anderson. Those other guys are going early enough that it's going to be difficult for them to really hammer ADP either way.
Yeah. So no, I just think it's interesting. I think Mayfield is better than Darnold, but I'm interested to see how it actually plays out in real life. But we are back on the clock. Cortland Sutton goes off the board. Jameis Winston goes off the board. Daniel Jones did go off the board. I would have made a call for him. Zach Wilson is an option. Mac Jones is an option. Jalen Waddle is still there. I think we could probably play it out and see what quarterbacks come back to us in the next round, because we have Jared Goff as an option as well. Are you interested in Waddle here, or is there somebody else that's a clear pick for you?
Well, putting Breece Hall into the team would then give us a lot of flexibility, and he gives us that high-end upside. So we'd have two potential running back stars. He's a little bit of a discount to ADP. I think that he will continue to rise. We want to target players who are going to be more expensive later in the offseason. And then we can either select Waddle or a QB next time around. Does that work for you?
With 4 seconds left, so it's going to have to. I love the way you played that one out strategically. There was no. If you had left me with 15 seconds, Sean, I was going to say that I think that we should go Waddle there, but you strategically played that well. So hopefully Waddle will get around to us. I think I got a DM earlier today about who my most drafted players is, but I think as a combined unit, Sean, since we did pass up on Chase today, I think the majority of our teams we have come away with Breece Hall so far. So we do have a lot of faith in him, and that would have been one of the reasons there that I probably would have differentiated and taken Waddle. But we'll see how it plays back. Based on the quarterbacks that I touched on there, we talked in our previous drafts, Ryan Tannehill's not giving us that much excitement, but you mentioned the likes of Marcus Mariota, who tends to be going in the 8th round. But in this range, we have Zach Wilson normally going as quarterback 22, then Mac Jones, then Ryan Tannehill, then Jared Goff, then Carson Wentz, and Goff usually goes in the mid-6th round. So when we're looking at the options here of who could come to us in the 6th round, the other name I'll throw out, Sean, TJ Hawkinson usually goes in the 6th round here as well. Deontay Johnson, another name in there. But I think we do have an option here if we have Zach Wilson, and you've talked a little bit about Mac Jones on a few recent podcasts. I think one of those could be interesting, but if Waddle's still there for me, it's going to be very hard to pass him up for one of the quarterbacks. How are you feeling?
Well, one of the reasons that I probably was okay with going Breece Hall is that I have an absolute ton of Jalen Waddle, and I think that that's going to play out nicely. I mentioned
more than 100% exposure that we have to Breece Hall.
No, probably not more than 100, but I don't think that Waddle has the same ability in terms of where he's locked in the wide receiver pecking order to make the kind of jump that I still think that we're going to see with Hall. I wouldn't be surprised if Hall is, a mid-round 2 pick in non-Superflex by the time that we get to late August. Waddle is locked in to where he is unless Tyreek Hill gets hurt or Waddle makes just some insane plays in the preseason, which those things are not impossible, right? But Hall is almost going to continue to rise regardless of what happens. We saw that last year with Javonte Williams. Now, he was starting from farther back and was rising, but you're going to get worse prices on Hall. I don't think that you're going to get different prices on Waddle. I also don't know that Waddle is as important in this particular format as he might be in some others. The other thing there is simply that because we have the 2 wide receivers early and because quarterback is a potential option, I think that missing out on Waddle, which did happen, Waddle was drafted as the 5'11". That doesn't kill us because quarterback might be the position that we want to go to anyway. Now, in terms of the Waddle versus Hall, that's a situation where maybe, again, you prefer Waddle and then come back with the quarterback. The other player that you mentioned here that I think is always compelling and definitely compelling in the FFPC would be TJ Hawkinson. We've talked some about how you can actually exploit the differences in ADP by taking him in other formats, even though he's such a good fit in this one. The price differences actually encourage you to take him in others. He's a late 6th round pick. He's not going to come back to us. That's a consideration, but we might continue to look for values. I don't know. I'm split here because Wilson, Tannehill, Goff, none of those guys really are deserving of a 6th round pick for me. And yet, if we don't select them here, we're going to start to get into a lot of trouble. And then as we continue to pass in later rounds, you get into this dynamic where in order to get good value, you have to press that. But if you push it and miss, then you could just destroy your entire team.
Yeah, so the players that are available, we're back on the clock as Mac Jones goes off the board, then Cam Akers. We have the option to get Hawkinson, who you mentioned. I would be here between Hawkinson and the quarterback. The quarterback that I'd be willing to take here would be Zach Wilson, who is a little bit after ADP. I'm happy to go either way. It's going to put us in a little bit of a bind, regardless which way we go. We either get the elite tight end or we skip on him. But I do like the options that Zach Wilson has given us in some other drafts to pair him with some of the Jets passing options. But it's a tricky one here, Shawn. I'll let you pull the trigger since you decided that Breece Hall was the pick in the last round.
So because we selected Breece Hall, we do need to be aggressive. We're going to go ahead and select TJ Hawkinson. He gives us an edge that no other player will. And Colm, I'm interested to see, partly one of the fun things about doing these listener league drafts, we get to interact with the listeners. That's number one. But then number two, we get to get a sense of where players might fall in unusual drafts. The players that we had here at QB are drafted in the 6th round. You would think to yourself, well, they're not going to come back to you at the 709 regardless. But one of the things that we benefited from in the previous draft was that Zach Wilson fell far, far, far below ADP. We were able to take him at that point. I think also because we took him in that last draft, I was a little bit less interested in taking him here. Yeah. Jared Goff probably would have been the pick for me if we had gone quarterback.
Yeah, and we'll see how it plays out. There's a round and a half kind of to go before it'll get back to us, obviously. Zach Wilson went off the board shortly after. It was Jerry Jeudy, then Zach Wilson. So I'm interested to see, though, Shawn. I think there's a chance here that Goff will slide. He kind of tends to go, in terms of ADP, Jared Goff is kind of going mid-6th round. So that's where we are right now. But between that and our next pick, it is the Jared Goff, Carson Wentz, Davis Mills kind of range there, the only quarterbacks that go between the 6th and the 7th round in general in this. So in this one, we have Mac Jones, Zach Wilson. I think the ideal situation now for us would be if he came back, and also the fact that we have TJ Hawkinson, but the chances of him coming back are very slim. We did touch on it when we had Justin Jefferson as the pick over Chase, the hope then that T. Higgins would come back to us. That did work out. We have obviously talked now about Jalen Hurts. We passed on A.J. Brown. The hope was that we might get Devontae Smith later in the draft, for example. So now we have Hawkinson. The hope is that we'll see a little bit of a slide maybe for Jared Goff. But yeah, if we're into that real stage that, Shawn, we find ourselves in quite a bit this offseason, whether it was the pre-draft drafts or the sophomore and rookie drafts, we have rolled the dice a little bit in these Superflex formats with the quarterback position. And Jared Goff goes off the board, so that part's not going to happen for us. But in terms of Jalen Hurts, we do have that security blanket that we haven't had on a lot of those other occasions when we have rolled that dice. So we will see. Carson Wentz isn't somebody that I'm going to be taking on my rosters this year. I assume that you're in line step with that. That's a yes or no answer, which I think the answer is yes.
We're still betting on Sam Howell there.
Yeah, and then Davis Mills is somebody who, again, you talked about projections and trying to judge some of these offenses and what could happen, and sometimes we are wrong. Is there any chance that we see some value for him more than the quarterback's 27 that he's already going at in these super flex formats? That can be a yes or no answer also if you want.
Yeah, I mean, there's always that possibility. He played well enough to earn himself another chance. They're obviously in a good situation here where if he plays well, they have their quarterback. If he plays poorly, the team is bad. And so they're going to be in that situation where they're going to get one of these elite guys. They at least have an approach that is internally consistent, that makes some sense, that could allow them to be good in the future. The Texans are so many years away from being competitive, and probably a new coaching staff, a new front office. if the front office that is not going to be there anymore by the time that they do get things going is able to do a few things like this for them, get them an elite quarterback, get them a chance to evaluate QBs. That's been one of the strange things about what happened this past offseason is that teams who are not competitive, who need to put themselves in that 2023 mix, opted to choose veteran bridge QBs who all it can do is put you in the middle of the pack. You can't evaluate young players. There's just no benefit to what they did. Houston, even though it's more demoralizing for the fans, but in part because just overall the team is so weak, not just the quarterback position, but at least that makes sense. At least they have a path into the future. If he breaks out, that'll be great. I mean, he doesn't have a lot of weapons around him, so it'll be difficult. He's going to have to be much better than people think.
So since that last pick that I mentioned, J.K. Dobbins, Ryan Tannehill, Gabriel Davis, Marquise Brown, Dallas Goedert, now Darnell Mooney have gone off the board. Shawn, sometimes the ADP will kind of go out the window a little bit with these RotoViz overtime leagues because a lot of the strategies we imply get moved into this league. You mentioned it being kind of unique just a moment ago, but in this one, it's not all that different, give or take from what we would normally see in terms of ADP. So playing out quite well for us so far. Now, we do have 2 running backs, so I think unless something happens perfectly for us at the quarterback position, I think we'll be continuing to move on. So I think we're starting to look to see if we can stack up some wide receivers at this point. In terms of, at the moment, we are in round 7. In round 7, around our picks, this is the range where when we're in standard leagues, I feel it goes a little bit flat for us. So there's, DK Metcalf, Brandon Cooks, Allen Robinson, Jerry Jeudy, Rashad Bateman are the wide receivers. Juju Smith-Schuster could creep in there as well. So looking through how this draft is going so far, as DK Metcalf and Rashad Bateman go off the board, both of those in this range would be my preferred targets. So we miss out on those. So I mentioned that the ADP sometimes goes out the window. They may have pushed us into a little bit of a flat zone here in terms of what we're trying to look for as our pick progresses. Zach Ertz, next player off the board. So we are 2 picks away, Shawn. Allen Robinson, the other player that went off the board there. Jerry Jeudy, for me, probably the standout of these wide receivers. Anyone else that's of interest? Bateman really was the one that I was hoping would have lasted true to us here.
Yeah, Bateman has an ADP in the early 8th round, so he does go a little bit early. Our top guys on the board are Juju and Amon-Ra St. Brown. St. Brown, an interesting faller after he was so good at the end of last season, and considering that Jameson Williams is unlikely to have a big impact early on in the season, there's a window for him to really establish himself. Now, we do have TJ Hawkinson, and so that's a consideration in terms of how it will play out in week 17. If both of those guys blow up, it's obviously going to drag Jared Goff up as well, a player we don't have on our roster. But Colm, as you look through here, there's no value at the running back position. We don't really like the wide receivers. We have our tight end. It does look like it's these guys at receiver. Chris Godwin in there, not expected to make a big impact early on. Amari Cooper, Adam Thielen, not players we're targeting. Elijah Moore, the other guy here. Or we could just start out with the rookies. It's never a bad time when the clear-cut players are off the board to take Drake London. And I think this is a good situation also to take Devontae Smith.
Yeah, I think we go to Smith. I think that is we have an opportunity to let him come to that next pick, but at this particular point in time, it has got a little bit flat. He likely would normally be the player you'd be taking in the next round. But I think that because it went as flat as it did there on us, I think that was the right pivot. Hopefully one of those other wide receivers like Juju or Amon-Ra St. Brown will make it back to us. They usually do go in the 8th round. And I did misspeak there for people listening in. Jerry Jeudy had actually gone quite a bit above ADP. He went after that TJ Hawkinson pick in the last round. So I think pivoting there, Shawn, was the right way to do. But we are ahead of ADP there by a round and a half to 2 rounds. And maybe when I mentioned things not getting skewed too much, maybe because of the Superflex element, it allowed things to play out there kind of as normal as possible, I guess. But wide receivers starting to really become a premium as Juju Smith-Schuster does go off the board on that next pick. So we do have a stack though, Shawn. We have Hurts and Devontae Smith, obviously for the Eagles. The Eagles play the Saints in week 17. So we'll try and see how things play out. But we did reach on him. How do you feel about that reach on to pair him up with Jalen Hurts? I think too, like we talked at one of our recent shows was about reaching for certain players that are the right profile. And while we talk about reaching here, by actual wide receiver rank, we haven't actually reached that much. It's basically that we've kind of bypassed some of the running back options. The other options in the queue at this point were Ezekiel Elliott, David Montgomery, Carson Wentz, Josh Jacobs, Antonio Gibson, Elijah Mitchell, AJ Dillon, Marcus Mariota, Davis Mills. So a lot of the options there we weren't going to be drafting anyway. So how do you feel though? Will you count that as a reach?
Well, I mean, it's obviously a reach by ADP, but it's not one of those reaches that you necessarily are concerned about. He's not a player who is going to come back around to us at the end of round 9. Now we're still in round 7, but that also frees us up. We were in, as you mentioned, a little bit more of a flat area. Now, if Amon-Ra, Elijah Moore, and Drake London all go in these next 4 picks, and none of the 3 of them get back to us, then it will have been a pretty significant mistake, because then there's another teardrop after them. You wouldn't have wanted to put yourself in the position to miss out on that tier break. But for the exact reasons that you mentioned, this draft is playing out how we would expect, where the OT listeners are pretty sophisticated best ball drafters. They're going to understand the slight differences in this format and why that changes the early running back versus wide receiver selection. I'd say slightly, but meaningfully. And yet, once we get into this range, where now you're staring dead zone running backs right in the face, it's a different dynamic in terms of where the red zone actually is when you're talking about Superflex. But once you're into it, you're not going to see OT listeners load up on those backs. So now we're in a situation where it flips, and it's going to be a huge run at wide receiver. You're still going to want to put yourself in a position where a wide receiver fills your single flex spot that's still available. I think that over the next 3 rounds, this is going to be almost all yellow. We're going to see wide receivers fly off the board.
Yeah, I think we are. I think you're well and truly right there. And that's why sometimes we'll go back to the Breece Hall pick again, but sometimes in these leagues, I think we're going to see those 0 RB candidates come at a nice price a little bit later, but maybe we'll pass up on some of them. We'll see how it plays out. So, Shawn, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown go off the board, but that was also with Chris Godwin, the team we talked about in the 11th spot. They have now got Mac Jones, Davis Mills, and Carson Wentz. Not the most exciting quarterbacks, but they've got themselves 3 quarterbacks to pair up with what they did at the start of the draft. 1 pick away for us, and we do have Elijah Moore and Drake London as options. You also have Brandon Ayuk in the queue. I think at this point, for me, Elijah Moore would be my preferred option. And that's basically, we've talked about this a little bit, and the advantage of drafting in volume is you can differentiate in some of these. We've drafted Drake London a lot, well I have personally, and I have drafted Garrett Wilson quite a lot as well. So I think it's a chance maybe to get Elijah Moore. How are you feeling here in a 1v1 scenario? Are you go as Moore your pick here as he goes off the board, so that now becomes null and void?
I was going to say I might still prefer Drake London.
Nice save.
In part because I guess that, I don't know, I hope Zach Wilson pans out. I have him in a variety of Superflex Dynasty leagues, and I have a lot of Elijah Moore, a lot of Garrett Wilson. If he plays poorly, it's going to be some pretty disastrous sort of carry-on effects from that. But I do think that Drake London is going to get better QB play. And as a result, I think that his ceiling ends up just being so high. He also has some fun matchups down the stretch of the season. They could be in a Week 17 shootout with the Arizona Cardinals. I can imagine him going off at that point in the year for, a 200-yard, 3-touchdown game. And that's going to seem kind of silly, but we saw that type of performance from Jamar Chase at the crucial juncture last year. Drake London, probably not the same level of talent, but we know from the freak score results over multiple years that these size athlete types of receivers are priority threats in the red zone. It's going to be difficult for teams to account for both London and Pitts. I think that the Falcons are actually being undersold a little bit. I think you're getting good prices on them. That also brings into play here potential for us to select Marcus Mariota or to select Desmond Ridder late. And that element, since we're going to be stuck a little bit at QB, and not stuck, I mean, this is something that we've planned for, but I like to have that flexibility to target one of those two QBs late.
As we look through those 8 rounds, and we have a 20-round draft here where we need to fill this roster up and get the ideal construction as things continue to play out here. How are you feeling so far, and what are some of the true elements you think are going to make or break this roster in the next 11 rounds?
I just love this team to be able to get those 2 star running backs, or the star running back in Derrick Henry, and then the upside play with Breece Hall, the top running back in this draft class, and probably an undervalued running back overall. And to still be able to get Justin Jefferson, T. Higgins, and then the youth, the second-year breakout potential for Devontae Smith. I think the gap between him and A.J. Brown is massively inflated, even though we're big A.J. Brown fans. Then to add Drake London there, again, the best wide receiver in this year's draft. 2022 rookies continue to be very inexpensive in drafts. I think you have to hammer them. We get our guy TJ Hawkinson. It was really the only pick that made sense in this particular league, even though we have a lot of him. We have that foundation QB. We weren't the first team to get to 4 wide receivers, but we were one of the early teams to do it. So we're going to have that wide receiver edge. Obviously, a lot of it is going to come down to what we do at quarterback. We're the only team to only have 1. All of their teams obviously have 2, and a lot of teams have 3. The teams with 3 will probably not select more, although that is an option if you want to go that route. We selected 1 early and then have waited. And again, if you don't get the second QB sort of within that QB window, it is important to wait. We've executed that. You can see that in the roster construction explorers. Now, Colm, it's going to be a matter again of trying to hit on some of these potential upside guys, and we're giving ourselves a chance with scenarios to win the overall tournament. It obviously puts you a little bit on the back foot in terms of winning your individual league if those scenarios don't play out.
Yeah, if they don't play out, we could be in a spot of bother here. But as round 9 does come off, we have Treylon Burks, Brandon Ayuk, Devin Singletary, who's one of my highest drafted guys this year, and then we have Ken Walker going off the board. Some interesting builds starting to take shape as well, Shawn. It's going to be fun to break these down after the draft is all said and done. We are a couple of picks out from our selection, 5 picks away at the moment. We have a lot of options in the queue, Shawn, but maybe not really the guys that are really the targets at this point. We have the 2 running backs. This is the 0 RB area of running back drafting that we are trying to target when we have less running backs. Are we still dipping in here with Derrick Henry and Breece Hall, or are we looking into some of the wide receiver options? There's some very, very interesting young wide receiver options that are going in this range as well. And then, we did get a great price on him, obviously, because he hadn't been, traded at that point. But Baker Mayfield kind of is going in this range by updated ADP. Any interest in him, or how are you looking to play it out here?
I think that you have to consider Mayfield at this juncture. You had mentioned the running backs, Josh Jacobs and Clyde Edwards-Helaire come off the board. Those are still pure dead zone guys for me. Miles Sanders, Tony Pollard, pure dead zone guys. Kareem Hunt, maybe a little more interesting. Damian Harris, a pure dead zone guy. Cordero Patterson, maybe a little bit more interesting. So I think that we're not quite to the 0 RB options yet at that position. We have young wide receivers in Sky Moore, Kadarius Toney, Chris Olave, Claypool, Garrett Wilson, and then some of our favorites like Tyler Boyd, Rondell Moore, Jarvis Landry. Plenty of depth at wide receiver. A lot of those guys we would expect to still go quite a bit later. We're not to their ADPs yet. So much flexibility here, Colm, and because we have the 2 running backs, because we have TJ Hawkinson, we really can go almost any route, and that potentially makes Mayfield a little bit more interesting. I don't know that we're in the position for a second tight end yet. What would you like to do here?
Yeah, I'm interested in Mayfield based on the build that we do have. I think that we could fit him in, and it gives us hopefully a starting quarterback. Although, I don't think you can let previous discounts stop you from drafting a player who still would fit into the build. So I think he's the way to go, unless we could potentially let him run around. The other one you mentioned is Olave. I do think that we could pair Olave. The Saints are playing the Eagles in week 17. So that's another play if you don't think that he's going to get back, and we can risk it on the quarterback. But so we take Mayfield there. Shawn, I did mention Olave. We talked about some. I'm hoping he doesn't go off the board here. My play was to get Mayfield and then Olave as we wrap around. I was kind of making the pitch if you felt strongly about taking Olave there, but how are you feeling? How confident are you out of 10 that Olave gets back to us?
Well, he has an ADP of 11, 12, and there are some players in between who I think might be more dynamic, might be more fun. Kadarius Toney, Sky Moore. Now, there are other ways to play both of those offenses. There's other play the Saints, too. Jarvis Landry has generated a lot of enthusiasm in the early going after making the move to New Orleans. Ben likes to point out that his targets per route run were very strong again last season. Now, he didn't play all of the routes. That was one of the things that really, I mean, there were so many infuriating things about week 17 last season. Baker Mayfield throwing all those passes into the offensive line, to the defensive line, and then not being able to hook up at the end was heartbreaking. But in between there was a section where Jarvis Landry sat out. We don't know that his route percentage is necessarily going to jump in New Orleans. If Michael Thomas is available to play, you could see formations in which it's Michael Thomas and Chris Olave. Olave obviously drafted as a NFL-ready rookie wide receiver. And with where they drafted him, I mean, he's going to be a focal point of the offense. One of the other interesting things, and there's potentially a big difference in quarterback play, but Jameis Winston is just in such a weird environment now to where, you know, he throws the 30 interceptions and he's this amazing quarterback for fantasy. He goes to the Saints and essentially looks like Jacoby Brissett. If that offense runs the same way that the Cleveland Browns offense is going to run, for example, then, I mean, there's not a lot of reason to take Olave over someone like a Jahan Dotson, who has just been generating absolute raves there in Washington. It's one of the reasons why I think Terry McLaurin is, again, more or less undraftable. I mean, he's been undraftable all the way with Carson Wentz. But if you have Carson Wentz's caliber of play and then bring in someone like Dotson, who actually plays extremely well, maybe is even better, then, you know, again, that's going to knock down your target share within the context of an offense that you probably wouldn't expect to be very efficient. But so my thought here would be is that even though Olave is a nice fit with players that we already have, there might be, you know, more or less these pseudo arbitrage opportunities later on in the draft if we felt like there was a different play that we needed to make here. So are there other guys that you're looking at? Do you like Sky Moore in this spot to get a little bit of exposure to the Kansas City Chiefs? Obviously, Marquez Valdez-Scantling has been the player generating the headlines there, in part because Moore had a hamstring injury during offseason activities. If not for that hamstring injury, I mean, Sky Moore probably would be just really flying with his ADP. Now, I mean, there are reasons to be concerned. It is a target situation that could be very split, and he might not be the guy the Chiefs are hoping that he is. But so there are some different elements going there. You know, you mentioned Elijah Moore. You mentioned having a lot of Garrett Wilson. I have a hard time passing up on Garrett Wilson at this juncture of the draft. Also have a little bit of a hard time passing up on Rondale Moore, even though, again, his ADP is far beyond the spot.
Yeah, the other players that I would put a pitch on, and we are back on the clock. Mike Gesicki goes in this range if we're looking to get that second tight end. I think we could go, but I know we do have some targets that we really do like as we move forward. So I'll put a pitch in for him as the tight end. Happy to go with Sky Moore, who I haven't drafted a lot of based on how much his ADP has risen, but it's kind of stayed steady now with the injury, obviously. So I'm really here, Shawn, between Garrett Wilson or Mike Gesicki at this point.
So you prefer Garrett Wilson over Sky Moore?
Oh, let's go Sky Moore then. I haven't drafted Sky Moore very often. So we do draft Sky Moore, Shawn. I'm going to ask you a question in a second. You asked me the question, did I like Wilson over Sky Moore? It felt like you might have wanted to go Wilson with that pick, differentiating it up. We would go when we get Sky Moore. Also passed up on Gesicki. Interested to know if that's that you're not interested in drafting him, or just that you wanted to get one of the young wide receivers at that point. I was going to make a call after our last pick that Team 12 would draft Russell Gage because they are accumulating some Buccaneers, players with Tom Brady in those early rounds. But I didn't call it, Sean, and now it's too late to call it, so we can ignore that. But overall, we get Sky Moore. What's your thoughts there versus the players that we were potentially discussing? And the last thing I want to say before I get that answer, we did have a message in the chat that does say the OT guys are currently discussing Mariota with no real plans of drafting him. So they really know what's happening here.
That's exactly right. It's exactly right. Well, I thought that there was this very outside shot that Garrett Wilson might come back around. Obviously, he didn't. He was drafted several picks later. He has an ADP that comes after Sky Moore, so I thought it made sense to get Sky at this juncture. We've discussed, some of the limitations that Garrett Wilson could potentially have there with Zach Wilson. I do like what we did in our last draft where we had Zach Wilson really fall to us. And at that point, we had to take him. And it was an absolute no-brainer. And then we did set it up to get Garrett Wilson coming back around. So we diversify a little bit in terms of OT Listener League teams. I sort of like that element. I do think there is a dynamic where Sky Moore could absolutely explode in late August, early September. I haven't been drafting him a lot because I think that unlike some of the other rookies, we do have a few questions about where he was drafted, the fact that the Chiefs were willing to move down and risk losing him. They didn't exactly make a statement about wanting him in the same way that the Patriots, for example, made a statement about wanting Tyquan Thornton. So some of that is just good tactics, right? You're thinking, well, if we don't get Sky Moore, then we probably get George Pickens. We would have loved to have Pickens in Kansas City. If Pickens had been drafted into Kansas City, I think that he would be going, in the maybe even in the 7th round of Superflex drafts. The enthusiasm for him would have been absolutely off the charts. It's a little bit harder to see there in a situation where he's covered up by Deontay Johnson and Claypool, where the quarterback situation could switch mid-season. That's not exactly what you're looking for in terms of having a rookie wide receiver breakout. You'd like to have a little bit of that continuity. You'd like to have actually a star QB elevating the rookie wide receiver. That's kind of covering him, keeping his ADP in check. We talk about some of the reasons that Jahan Dotson's ADP is being kept in check. Looking forward a little bit, you mentioned the joking about Marcus Mariota and whether or not we would take him. He's got around 8 ADP, obviously falling below that. Some of the other players then who come up here would be a Deshaun Watson. There are still drafters taking that shot on him, despite the fact that at least the breadcrumbs would suggest that he's looking at maybe even more than a season suspension, but at the very least probably won't be able to play until the very final weeks of 2022. Mitch Trubisky in 11. That's sort of interesting since I still think that he's going to be a first month kind of quarterback, even though Pickett is supposedly not challenging him at all for the starting position to start the season. They do still seem to like Pickett. You listen to some of the things their wide receivers are saying. They like what he brings to the table. I think that Pickett is an interesting pick. You mentioned Jimmy Garoppolo. If we don't get Marcus Mariota, Desmond Ridder and Marcus Mariota are guys we've kind of been going back and forth on in some of our drafts. That's a tricky one because if you get the production in the wrong part of the season, then you could get right to the precipice and then miss. But again, in that case, you still do have a couple of quarterbacks. You would need those quarterbacks to have scored impressive numbers for you there. Maybe that's a little bit less likely with a Baker Mayfield than if you had started QB, and then you're looking for your third quarterback. So I think a variety of things that could play out. We did have Garrett Wilson go in late 10, then Kadarius Toney. The other Chiefs way to get exposure with Marquez Valdes-Scantling. He goes to the Patrick Mahomes drafter, Zach, in the 102. You kind of like that mix there. Colin, one of the interesting things is that even though MVS has been generating a lot of buzz, and even though Packers watchers like yourself will also sing his praises. He's someone, if he hadn't suffered some injuries over the last couple of years, probably even gets a much bigger free agent contract than he got. And he got one that was substantial. The opportunity there, if Juju doesn't immediately break out, if Sky doesn't immediately break out, you could be talking about big numbers from Marquez Valdes-Scantling. And yet he's not someone who is generating these big offers in Dynasty. I haven't been able to move him in the leagues where I have him. A couple of the players that you mentioned, Chris Olave does go at the 10-11 turn. That's unfortunate. I did think that he had a potential to get back to us. And then also Rondell Moore. To put Rondell Moore with Drake London was kind of my dream scenario. That also no longer in play.
Yeah, so they were both options we were hoping to get, but we do still have a lot of different options that may be in play when it comes back here to us. Tyler Boyd, somebody who's still, going in this range. Other players that go in this range are all the way from Rojo, Ronald Jones, Noah Fant, Melvin Gordon, Kareem Hunt, Jahan Dodson, who you mentioned earlier. And then we could have our boy Tyler Boyd here as a potential option as well. So you mentioned MVS. I just have a hard time drafting him at his current price. When we look back to what he did with the Packers, a lot of it is, go routes, post routes that are going deep, and that's where the success is. A couple of slants that maybe he did break a tackle and take it to the house. People probably remember one against the Minnesota Vikings last season, I believe that was. But he did have injuries, but I think it's also there's some other limitations to the game. So if we're looking at who could really break out in this offense, I think Sky Moore or Juju are my preferred options to target here. Shawn, we are one pick away. Tyler Lockett goes off the board, Chase Claypool, Robert Woods, so some veteran wide receivers going off the board. So when we're looking here, Mariota is an option, Hunt's an option. I think I'm passing up on quarterback here again, unless you want to make that call on me. Are we looking into tight end 2 range with Noah Fant? Are we looking to get another running back? They're probably the preferred options for me based on how things played out at this point.
We look at the other teams that will be drafting in between us. 2 of them have 3 QBs. The team AJ at the 112 only has 2. He might be tempted to come back, even though Trey Lance, Tom Brady, you're going to be doing a build that doesn't emphasize QB after that once you have that foundation. I was thinking that Mariota was a pretty compelling pick, at least at one of these 2 selections. Who's the player that you would like instead? One of the reasons I think we could let him drop is that we have both Boyd and Landry, for example. We have some other young QBs. You mentioned the tight ends. Give us a pick here. Who would you like?
We're going to run out of time. We'll take Mariota. Shawn does it again.
Colm
he asks
does not trust me to hit the pick at the 1 second. I did get some feedback that at least one listener did his favorite part of the last show was when I claimed that we're allowed to pick with 1 second. So someone thought that was humorous. Colm, you seem like you're still nervous at the 1 second mark.
No, people are loving it because when we're doing the live streams with myself and Zachary Kruger, Zach is usually doing it. And even this past week, we brought in a sound effect to let us know when we were on the clock, just to make sure that we did. He believes that I do what you do, where it's like, these are the players that I might be interested in, but who do you want? And there's like 2 seconds left on the clock. So it is good fun. It is going to be interesting as well that we did mention that comment earlier in the show that we would be talking about Marcus Mariota and we wouldn't draft him. I probably, again, we talked about this on one of our recent shows, but again, to differentiate and get different exposures is probably the way to go here. But when we're playing the Atlanta offense, I think that by the time we get to the playoffs in fantasy football and heading towards week 17, I think that this team probably is going to be out of contention. I think that leads them to see what they have with the rookie quarterback in Ridder. But again, that may not happen, and they may stick with Mariota. So I would love to see Mariota have that second run, the Ryan Tannehill run, if you want to call it that, and see how he does. But we'll see who Shawn plays back to. Some of the names that I did mention previously were those running back names, like a Melvin Gordon. There is some tight ends, though, in this range. Noah Fant was the other name that I did mention that I think I would have pitched for the Fant pick potentially at that last spot where we took Mayfield. Irv Smith went since then, Tyler Boyd. How do you feel here about Fant potentially in this next round, or what are you feeling is the right way to play this? I don't want any more quarterbacks. That's the main thing.
You don't want to go Kenny Pickett with the next selection?
No.
Well, Colm is being a little bit of a spoil sport there at QB, forcing us to tight end. No, I mean, I like the players here. One of the things that I would like to see in drafts over the next couple of weeks is where people sort of settle on Fant now that that potential selection of Baker Mayfield, or the move for Baker Mayfield with the Seattle Seahawks, is no longer in play. Now, they could still do something like try and get a Jimmy Garoppolo. I think there are a lot of barriers for that actually happening. And again, I mean, the Seahawks are now kind of pitching this narrative of tanking and getting ready for 2023. Fant is someone who is so good. We've talked about this a lot. He thrived to an extent. I mean, he was not a difference maker. I think that if he had gone to a team that had good quarterback play, you would potentially see him jump into the Big Five. To go to a team that is at the exact opposite end of the spectrum is pretty disappointing. And yet, if you're talking about Dynasty, he's still so young and so dynamic. I think you should be trying to acquire him now for what his value might be in mid-2023, because he's going to give you some production in between as well. And then you could be looking at it having the next Travis Kelce a couple of years from now. The issue in 2022 redraft now becomes, where do you want to price him if the full season ceiling is probably not where you were hoping? The individual week season, and this is one of the things that I've mentioned to several drafters and guests and all of that type of thing, is still high. I mean, he worked out for us in week 17 last year. That was one of the reasons why the team kind of vaulted up ahead of the other team that was a Burrow Chase team, was because of that Fant production in the fourth quarter of week 17 last year. Hunter Henry goes, so Fant is the top tight end by ADP. That doesn't necessarily adjust, obviously, for the very most recent move. Other guys we would be looking at here would be basically Gerald Everett. Colm, it's tricky because we know that we want this team to have tight end firepower. If you don't start to make the selections here, you're going to end up with weak tight ends. We discussed how in the last draft, even though we waited and played a zero QB approach, it was actually tight end that was the position that we had the most questions about when the draft was actually over. That was the position that we thought could keep us from winning the tournament, even if our QBs were successful. So now that we're here and probably aren't going to see these guys come back around, I think that either selecting Fant or Everett, and you could hope that Everett might come back. But again, I think that's sort of a pipe dream. If we don't take one of these two players here, we're going to only have one decent tight end in this league.
Yeah, so I think I would lean Fant, and we have some Jets exposure. They play the Seahawks in week 17 as an option there. I'm drafting Fant over Everett, but I'm drafting both of them in a lot of leagues. But I don't think we have an option to get either of them if we don't take one at this point. So I think I would draft Fant.
So despite his displeasure with the early Breece Hall pick, Colm is now predicting. Well, it sounds to me like you're thinking Breece Hall just slices through the Seahawks defense, probably gets a couple of 60-yard touchdown runs. He has that low 4.4 speed, despite the fact that scouts don't think that he's a big play runner. But if he breaks off a couple 60-yard runs, goes for 215 and 4 touchdowns. And again, I mean, these are scenarios that we have witnessed playing out, throughout the last 15 years. We know that running backs can put up those big scores in week 17. Once the Seahawks are down, are trailing because of what Breece Hall has done to them in the first half, you think they're going to be very, very pass heavy. It's going to be DK Metcalf and Noah Fant to the rescue as the Seahawks try and pull out that week 17 victory to probably more or less knock them out of the top 2 picks and cost them CJ Stroud or Bryce Young.
There is a potential. We always say there is, whatever timeline we're living on, there is a possibility somewhere in the universe that is going to happen. But my pitch was going to be previously to draft Noah Fant and then to draft his quarterback later in the draft, which is going to be Jimmy Garoppolo. But obviously that it was still, we could go with a 4 quarterback build, but that was my kind of pitch was going to be. But we will have an interesting range here of the draft now over the next 2 or 3 rounds, where there is a lot of players we do like going. Everett could potentially get back to us, but I think he goes as well. How are you feeling, Shawn, now with that 2 quarterback build with Fant and Hawkinson? I'm happy to roll with that in this roster. Are you looking to still add firepower to the tight end position outside of something amazing happening like Everett getting back to us?
Yeah, I mean, that would be the dream. I don't think that will happen. We would snap him up if it did. If not, I think you continue to have to look at taking someone like a Trey McBride. If you sort of troll through the Cardinals reporting, you will see people who are excited about that pick, people who are frustrated by that pick, plenty of analysts who maybe don't understand it, but also analysts who think that he could be used sort of in a variety of ways, because many of the scouting reports believe that he's going to be immediately a better blocker than Zach Ertz. I mean, Zach Ertz is more or less a possession receiver at this point, right? He's your kind of Jarvis Landry. He's going to run a couple yards. He's going to catch the pass. He's going to fall down. Trey McBride, a more dynamic blocker, someone who has a lot more speed. He's going to give you more run after the catch. You're going to have a bit more of a vertical element. I guess even despite the history of rookie tight ends, and one of the things we have to consider is that rookie tight ends are going to gradually start to go the direction of rookie wide receivers. One of the reasons you don't see all of them break out is the same reason that you don't see all rookie wide receivers break out. And there are a lot fewer tight ends who are potentials to break out in any given year. So for the ones who don't hit, then you have this dynamic of, rookie tight ends are not going to give you production. But both McBride and Greg Dulcich really have that potential this season if their offense works the right way. In both cases, the biggest thing working against them is probably not readiness, but simply that the offenses have too many other targets, too many other mouths to feed. But the upside is there, I think, especially with DeAndre Hopkins being out for those first 6 weeks. One of the things that we're always trying to do is figure out the least expensive way to play the scenarios that could work from a team perspective, the scenarios that could play out from a positional perspective, and the scenarios that could play out from an injury or a suspension perspective. So if you have a dynamic here where the cost for a player like Marquise Brown has been elevated because DeAndre Hopkins isn't there, you have that second year breakout enthusiasm for Rondale Moore, even though there were a lot of red flags about what he did in 2021. The inexpensive way to play it is through Trey McBride. It may be the least likely one to pay out, but you're getting a good price on it relative to those other scenarios. So you still have to have at least some exposure. We've done that in some other drafts. We don't have to do it in this one, but it is something we can look at if the draft dictates it much later on.
So, Shawn, since that last pick, we have had Damon Harris go off the board. We've had Cardell Patterson, Kenny Golladay, Ronald Jones, Melvin Gordon, Tim Patrick, Alexander Madison. Everett does go off the board. Team 1 building an interesting lineup, but that is Everett as the first tight end there. Then Naheem Hines, Jacoby Myers, DJ Chark, Jameson Williams. And then we have Rashad White going off the board. So Jones and White would have been 2 options that we would be interested in, but there is a couple of running backs coming up here that are of interest. When you're drafting those Lions wide receivers, I would assume, I could be wrong, I would, even with the injury concerns, Williams for me would be going ahead of DJ Chark, who do go back-to-back here picks in the 1303 and the 1304.
It's tough because I think you're going to get Williams' production in that part of the season when you need it the most, but it does knock down a roster spot. Now, when you're talking about round 13, round 14, where his ADP is, then the cost isn't so extreme that it will necessarily eliminate that pick from consideration. DJ Chark's ADP is at the 1602. He's really an enigma at this point, to where I think that drafters who are loading up on him could end up winning every league they play, specifically because he bounces back and has the type of season he had in year 2, but he could end up being sort of a burned roster spot. We like him. We like his talent. It's tricky there in Detroit because even if he is good, there will be some target competition as the season progresses. Williams, I think, has the potential to be the number 1 and even the clear number 1 in this class by the time everything is said and done. We'll probably see that manifest more in mid-2023. So, Colin, we're up. We have a minute here to work with. Interesting rookies in Christian Watson and Jahan Dotson are still available, so you have your Packers guy, Jarvis Landry, to play the Week 17 game that you've been discussing. His ADP is in early 14, which means based on this draft, this is right where we would need to take him. We're at the 1309. Where are you looking to go?
I don't usually go with the homer pick, but I think we should go with Christian Watson here. We do also have the Justin Jefferson stack as well for that Week 17 game. Packers and Vikings face off Week 17, so I think we can go that way. And based on ADP, I'm hoping that Landry might play back to us. If Landry doesn't get back, we still have a lot of other options. Then I'd probably pivot then to running back with Spiller and Gainwell as two potential options. We haven't talked a lot about Watson. I tend to not draft a huge amount of Packers, even though the team, Sean, that brought us success last year was the Devontae Adams and Aaron Rodgers stack, based on how the news was going early last offseason, with Aaron Rodgers potentially not returning. It turns out then that this season the difference is that Devontae Adams is not on the Packers. But Watson, I think if you're looking, in a best ball league in a situation where the season's progressing as a rookie, very, very raw, but I think the upside there could be massive for fantasy, and particularly a best ball format where you're not having to rely on picking that week to week. And then he does fit in there as our wide receiver 6 in this roster.
Exactly. And I had mentioned earlier that Justin Jefferson was a little bit trickier to play because of the Week 17 dynamic. And that's in part because the Packers are a tricky team to play in 2022. However, when you get Watson at this price and you get him in best ball and you get him in a tournament, so this just incredibly wide range of outcomes that he brings to the table, I think that it's maybe more compelling here. It's also interesting in Dynasty where you can have some patience. I think in Dynasty, you're going to be able to select him and then flip him a year from now, even if he's not fantastic, because despite his advanced age, I think most fantasy managers are really looking to 2023 for him to break out. He has this monster ceiling with the athleticism that's matched by very few wide receivers in the NFL. If the Packers are actually chasing the Vikings in Week 17, and one of the things that Ben and I discussed on our Stealing Bananas show that focused on projected win totals in the betting markets on the teams this season is that maybe there was a little bit too much enthusiasm around the Packers. The NFC North could be sneaky good with the Vikings and the Lions, and even with the Chicago Bears if Justin Fields can do more than people are expecting despite his limited weapons. It's probably not the case, because the Packers probably will still be able to control games when you have the best quarterback, and the best quarterback by such a wide margin. That gives you the edge, even if the weapons are a little bit weaker. But this could be a work in progress. Colin, maybe by Week 17, the Packers actually do have it figured out. And that's also a scenario where it's just kind of fun to think of a Packers-Vikings shootout.
Yeah, and we talked quite a bit, and it was kind of you that really put it into my mind of like targeting those stacks that people aren't targeting, so you can be unique very, very easily. You've talked quite a bit about the Lions and the Bears. We are seeing the team in the third spot kind of move into that Lions-Bears kind of territory. But the thing about the Packers, and particularly getting Watson at that price, you mentioned possibly figuring things out as the season goes on. I think that they're going to have the best defense in the NFL as well. So I think that does affect the overall potential for fantasy scoring off them throughout the season. But in a one-off divisional round matchup against the Vikings, we've seen those games shoot out a number of different times. But when you take Jefferson at that point and you get a chance to take Watson at this current price, but there is a lot of, interesting flyers you can take late. Some of the stacks that isn't possible for the Week 17 games. We're not Sammy Watkins guys, but Aaron Rodgers has been talking him up a little bit. Then you have Dobbs is there as well. So it's interesting that there's possible very, very late round flyers that you could patch into that to have some upside potentially. So I'm very happy with that. What I'm hoping now is that we would, with one pick remaining, get Landry. I think that would be nice as well to pair up with the Eagles Saints stack, based on the fact we have Hurts and Devontae Smith, and Landry goes off the board with one pick to go. Gryffindor has broken our heart, Sean, with that one pick. So when we look to pivot here at the other options, for me, I think Isaiah Spiller would probably be my pick. We have Spiller. Gainwell could fit into that Philadelphia stack as well if we wanted to go that way there. My two top options here at the running back position.
And even though we lose Landry, it really is running back that we need to start hammering. So from that perspective, I think we're okay. It might even be a little bit of a gift Do you have a preference here, Colm? I mean, Isaiah Spiller, now that we're into round 14, he's been a guy who's jumping in recent drafts.
Yeah, I've been drafting Spiller quite a bit, so I'm going with both of these guys. Whoever's available, both of them are available here. Interest. My question was going to be then, we take Spiller for people listening in. Spiller has the potential, if anything happens to Eckler, to just go crazy. We talked earlier in the draft when we took Jalen Hurts. I said about the possibility of him having a huge season without his pass catchers having a huge season. What would you think in a situation like that? Of Gainwell has that pass catching profile, but when you're taking a running back and a running quarterback, do you think there's limitations there in drafting them on the same roster, or because it's best ball, is it something that really we could still have done there? That was kind of the split for me, was that to get a different game and to get a Chargers piece, because I do think that offense is going to score. This is not breaking news to anyone. That offense is going to score a lot of points.
Right. And one of the things that we find when we play with the stack explorers in the different best ball tools, we have the best ball win rate explorer, we have the Underdog explorer, and you can look at the different stacks, you can play with different things, is that putting the running back 2 much more than the running back 1 onto some of these teams where you have either the wide receiver 1, the wide receiver 2, perhaps the quarterback in play, that has been a successful way to approach kind of crafting these teams and in multiple formats over multiple years. So I do like that element, but I think that in some ways we're almost a little early for it still. I think we have to go for the best player. And I do think that in that particular instance, you probably like it better with a non-scrambling quarterback to do what we want from Jalen Hurts in week 16, in week 17. He's going to have to run. The running does tend to cause some problems for the running backs. If he scrambles for touchdowns, then you lose those goal line opportunities. If he's scrambling instead of dumping it off, you lose that opportunity. Gainwell is someone who has had such great peripherals as a rookie and was sort of an undervalued prospect coming in. You look at him in college, he was a much better player than Antonio Gibson on the same team. Now, again, they weren't necessarily even playing exactly the same position. So there are some caveats there. But you look at where he probably is from a talent perspective, and you look at how many points you think this team is going to score, he's someone I've been drafting everywhere. I don't know that I like him as much on this team, because you look at how week 17 could play out. I think you more prefer to have Gainwell on the teams that you don't have some of these Eagles, because it's a more specific type of scenario you need for him to really get that big score to carry through. I'm fine with missing him there. And it's also a situation where I do think that Spiller, even though there are questions about his talent, people obviously not that enthusiastic about how he tested athletically. Texas A&M has created some impressive numbers for other running backs who have not been big NFL contributors, but yet to have the backup to Eckler, someone who has gotten hurt someone who's just come out himself and said, I don't want to touch the ball nearly as often. I want to be a bigger weapon when I do touch the ball. And that's what really saying something, because he's been a massive weapon when he's touched the ball the last several years and basically his entire career. Isaiah Spiller, to be a young star in college and now to be a young back in the NFL, Blair Andrews has had plenty of different articles looking at that from a lot of angles. It projects very, very well. The upside in a Chargers offense is just so extreme. It's similar to what we talked about last season with Devin Singletary. If he ever does finally hit, he could hit in a big way. He did hit in a big way. It became a league-winning and a tournament-winning play from the managers who drafted him. In a lot of ways, the Spiller thesis is easier to make because you don't have to go through this question of, will the team actually use the running back? If Austin Eckler is out, Isaiah Spiller is going to have to be bad to not get the vast majority of the work. The other running backs there have already demonstrated that they're not NFL caliber players. That doesn't mean that they can't be quality deep backups, but they're not the players you want to touch the ball.
Yeah, no, I think that's all very well said. Shawn, I said I didn't want any more quarterbacks. There's a potential that there could be one more quarterback off interest coming up here and a couple of picks if you want to pair him with his tight end, and that's Jimmy Garoppolo. Have we any interest in the Jimmy Garoppolo to the Seattle Seahawks happening? Or are we looking at the other players here that would be piquing the interest? I think is Tyrion Davis-Price, Marlon Mack's going in this kind of zone here, but it feels like there's a couple of options here for this pick going in this direction, and then in the next round and the round after, we get into a lot of interest in wide receiver options. I think, like, we have Mayfield. I think Robbie Anderson could be somebody who could pair with him potentially in a round or so's time, but we are one pick away. Who is your preferred option here? If we want to go 4 quarterbacks, Ritter is gone. I'm not against Jimmy G here.
I think that he becomes a more interesting pick in round 20. We still have a lot of other options.
You think he's getting to round 20?
I do. And because he's not going to start for anybody this year. So we have this dynamic where Tyrion Davis-Price is still available. He's in a pretty similar situation to Isaiah Spiller. The team made the commitment by drafting him much earlier than was expected in the NFL draft. The reports from San Francisco beat writers have been that he is pretty clearly in the driver's seat for the number 2 role. Running backs in San Francisco who have been in that number 2 role have scored a lot of points over the last 5 years.
Yeah, well, he was the second option, Sean, but I'm just going to say this now. We'll draft him, but Jimmy G's not making it to the 20th round. But yeah, TDP is somebody as well. Like these rookie running backs, when we get into this range, a lot of the rosters that I'm building anyway are going to be looking to add running back firepower here who can go from potentially having a role at the start of the year to having a major role as the season does progress. So the thing with the 49ers as well is, you touched on, you don't have to be the starting running back to get points in this offense. They're going to run the ball a lot again, and hopefully not Deebo Samuel all the time. So maybe TDP gets those Deebo Samuel rushing touchdowns this year. But we'll see how it plays out. Sean, I touched on some of the potential interest and options at wide receiver. By ADP, it may still even be ahead of where we're looking here at this point. But when we look through the list of options available, some of the wide receivers that I've added to the queue, one of them that did interest me was Robbie Anderson, and that's because the fact that we have Baker Mayfield, we could potentially get that pairing together. KJ Hamler is one of the other ones, and 2 of the veterans that we continue now. This will be a little bit later, I think, as well, but Julio Jones and Will Fuller continue to be interesting options where we've basically talked about the Baker Mayfield effect. You sign with a roster, you trade, you jump a good few rounds. I think we'll see the same with Fuller or Julio if they sign with teams. Reports potentially linking Julio with a number of exciting options. The Packers been one, the Ravens been one. I think that would boost his ADP quite a bit. Who are some of your favorite wide receiver options here, or is there a different position that we're going to draft before we get to Jimmy Garoppolo in the 20th round?
Well, we're still only at 4 running backs. We need some more running back assistance. And any of these picks in this range, we could look at tight end. We could look at Trey McBride. I think that those are probably the priority picks before we move back to wide receiver. I do think that Robbie Anderson there, very late with Baker Mayfield, is at least vaguely interesting. It's tricky here because one of the things that you do end up with is that more than in some other seasons, right now with Julio and Will Fuller not signed, you've got some very late picks who are probably going to rise. You have KJ Hamler, who is always sitting out there. That is an interesting selection. Jerick McKinnon, Chris Evans, Marlon Mack, some backs you probably would prefer to take more at the very end. And that makes this pick a little bit controversial because it's not clear-cut where you want to go. That being said, once you're into the 16th round, really anything can happen. You don't want to pass up on a selection because you're trying to get them in round 20 as opposed to round 16.
So we are now 1 pick away. The picks that have gone since our last pick: David Bell, Corey Davis, Cameron Brate, Van Jefferson, Jalen Tolbert. So we have 1 pick to go, Sean. It is an interesting spot here. Now, if we're looking at a potential option, Marlon Mack is there. one of your favorites, but it's a little bit later. Well, possibly actually won't get back to us is Chris Evans of the Cincinnati Bengals. You mentioned running back. You mentioned Trey McBride as well as a possible option. Logan Thomas is there. Where do you want to go here?
I think that Evans and McBride are both picks that we have to look at because Evans has gotten to be pretty trendy. I think he fits nicely with T. Higgins. Also, he just has absolutely massive upside. If Joe Mixon were to get hurt and you're talking about winning tournaments, that's what you have to go for. McBride also, the listeners know he's someone we draft a lot. If there's someone else out there who feels like he would be a big part of their team, he might not wrap back around to us.
Yeah, well, McBride would be out of those two the pick that I would lean towards if we want to get that third tight end. So we do take Trey McBride. The one part with McBride and that selection is, I think Fanta's undervalued by a round to a round and a half at this particular point. But the fact is still that he is playing for the Seattle Seahawks, and there may not be a huge amount of red zone opportunities this season for them. So I think Trey McBride is a little bit of a safety net there, but massive, massive upside with him as well, coming in as a rookie. And you mentioned Ertz and, what he's going to do, after the catch, for example, and how he will fit into this offense and more of a potential Jarvis Landry, Jamison Crowder style role, which can still be extremely, extremely valuable. But Ertz did go in this draft in the mid-7th round, then Trey McBride's going in the early 16th round as we've taken him there. You're in a spot then where the team in 7th spot has taken Rob Gronkowski, who we've talked about, potentially drafting him to be back for a stretch run for the Buccaneers if he comes out of retirement. I think both of those, McBride is probably the way to play that over Gronkowski there. Shawn, when we are lucky now, we have 4 picks remaining. So far, we have 3 tight ends. We have 3 quarterbacks. We're waiting on Jimmy Garoppolo in the 20th round. At this particular point, we have 4 running backs. So just run through the team. We have Jalen Hurts, Baker Mayfield, Marcus Mariota, Derrick Henry, Breece Hall, Isaiah Spiller, Tyrion Davis-Price. Then at wide receiver, we have Christian Watson, Drake London, Sky Moore. So lots of young talent mixed with T. Higgins. We have Devontae Smith in the 2nd season, another third-year receiver in Justin Jefferson. Then we have tight ends of Noah Fant, TJ Hawkinson, and Trey McBride. Based on overall roster construction with 4 rounds left remaining, you mentioned already we do need some more running back help. Are we looking to put this into a 5 running back build or a 6 running back build? And I do think the trying part here is going to be, I do think when we're into this next round is where some of those interests and wide receiver options probably will fit into this roster for us.
It will. We have 4 picks left, and those picks will likely be a couple of running backs and a couple of wide receivers. Going beyond Trey McBride at the tight end position probably will not make sense. And we do have some very late running backs who are pretty interesting. We've been drafting Sony Michel quite a bit. He showed what he can do at the end of last season. The dynamic for him again this year is fantastic. The Miami Dolphins are a potentially emerging offense who will use a variety of players at running back, but any sort of health hiccups from the guys either in front of him or just in the committee with him, and Michelle would once again be that late season hammer. You have someone in Zamir White who some of the beat writers from the Raiders have suggested could be the guy sooner rather than later. I haven't made that pick very often, but I do think that it's interesting at the end of drafts. The problem that you're probably going to have with the Raiders is that both the early down touches are going to be split and the receiving touches are going to be split. When you're talking about a potential 4-way split of the high value touches, then almost all the backs are undraftable. Even Josh Jacobs at prices that would have just looked crazy a year ago definitely would have looked insane 24 months ago. Now it still might be too much. But if you're talking about the 20th round, it's kind of interesting. And then our guy, Benjamin has started to generate enthusiasm from drafters based on reports out of camp that he looks like someone who I wouldn't say can challenge James Conner, but he appears to be the guy. And we felt that he could be the guy based on talent. It's a situation there where if it's Benjamin or if it's Darrell Williams, the player who emerges and or is the last man standing, that Arizona Cardinals offense, even when they have some things work against them, the potential for single game eruptions and 3 or 4 week eruptions, very, very high. You have to have exposure to that backfield. The Cardinals made it a little bit tricky when they drafted a player and made the move to sign Williams. And yet that doesn't mean that the league winner still couldn't come out of the backups for the Arizona Cardinals.
Yeah, no, and it feels very much at this point of drafts that it would be worth that upside shot. Shawn, since I last updated, Brevin Jordan was off the board, Paris Campbell, Nico Collins. Big tears running down my face. As Jimmy Garoppolo does go off the board in the 16th round, late 16th, albeit. Then we have Gus Edwards, Jamal Williams, JD McKissick, and KJ Hamler. So, talked about some interesting wide receiver and running back options, Shawn. Hamler would have been one of those. It feels like at this point, though, the ideal situation, we talked about Chris Evans potentially at that last pick. He could potentially come back to us here. Robbie Anderson would be an option that we mentioned. Don't know how you feel about it. Myself and Zachary Kruger, one of Zach's favorite running backs to draft this year is Brian Robinson. He is in this range. If we get back and we have the option, Shawn, for Chris Evans, do you want to prioritize him over Anderson at this point?
Yeah, I think that Anderson remains a 19th.
He goes off the board as well, so that's okay. We don't have to worry about prioritizing any longer.
So the Robbie Anderson dream is dead.
Sean's very happy about that.
I'm going to go ahead and click the X on Sammy Watkins to make sure that he doesn't somehow get drafted by us.
Shawn says, you got Christian Watson. Do not push your luck on this draft. We're hoping to play it. We might get Dubes in the last round. A genuine 20th round pick. Somebody who may go in the 20th round. But we are, Shawn, one pick away here. I'm hoping that I think if we get Evans here, it's always nice when you talk about somebody in that previous round and they make it back to you. That hasn't really happened to us truly in this draft yet. So we have been sniped a couple of times with a pick remaining. So we'll hold our breath here as we wait for the pick.
As Ryan drafts the 1708, the other note here, almost all of the wide receivers did go in that last stretch. So between our move for McBride in the 1604 and coming back around, we lost Paris Campbell, a player we hadn't discussed but would have gone onto the board late. Hamler, Anderson, Fuller, Marvin Jones is selected. With Hamler, Anderson, and Fuller all going, and you made the note about Julio Jones, I think that we would have had to pick him. He's the only wide receiver really left at that point. And then we end up with a team that's maybe a little bit light at wide receiver. Now, we'll add Laviska Shenault on there. That's a way to feel good about that. But we are looking at a lot of running backs here. Jerick McKinnon, another name I think that has to be sort of to the forefront. He was easily the most dynamic back who played for the Kansas City Chiefs last season. They do make the move to sign him, although there's a possibility that he has zero role again this season during the regular season. Call it Chris Evans, your guy?
Yeah, I think we go Evans. I think there's a chance, I could be wrong, but I think there's a chance McKinnon gets back to us. I always really do enjoy when there's a decision to draft a player, you pass up on one of those guys and then he does get back. That was the hope, but it's not always the reality of that happening. So we'll see. If McKinnon gets back, Shawn, in 6 picks time, are we going back to the running back well based on what we've discussed there? It did for, unfortunately for us, get quite dry at the wide receiver position. The other wide receiver that would be there that is one of your guys is Kendrick Bourne. And just when I see Kendrick Bourne's name there, the other player that's there is John O. Smith. And I really enjoyed on a recent Stealing Bananas where Ben mentioned reports of John O. Smith, and then you said that you believe that those reports actually came from you. So I really enjoyed that. So any further reports on John O. Smith?
Yes, I am being told that he's going to be an H-back, which We heard that David Johnson was going to be an H-back, and then it was scorched earth. So maybe that's a good sign. Johnny Smith, a tricky one. Kendrick Bourne, I like, but I like more as someone who is actually a fantastic wide receiver 3 in reality, probably not someone that you can play in fantasy football. I mean, I say that, and he's the big play guy there when you look at what they have with Nelson Aguilar and Jacoby Myers. Those guys are not the players who make those types of moves, but now they have Devontae Parker, they have Tyquan Thornton. I mean, Thornton, a player who was drafted ahead of George Pickens and Sky Moore. So you have to look at him if you believe in Mac Jones and say there's best ball possibility there. I think that Thornton is a 20th round potential pick in this draft. I've been adding him in Dynasty as well. You mentioned Brian Robinson, Colm, and did you want to make any kind of pitch for him? Obviously, you've been spending time with Zach. You know what he thinks there. It's a tricky situation in that that's sort of Raiders part 2, where the high value touches look to be very split on a team that probably won't be down by the goal line nearly as often as the Raiders. The Raiders now look set with Derek Carr emerging and a lot of talent around him. I mentioned that Jahan Dotson has been generating big time plaudits, but I mean, this is still a team that is very much a work in progress. And one of the things that they have mentioned about Brian Robinson is that he could end up being the goal line back. And yet we think back a couple of years ago to the reason that Antonio Gibson was such a trendy player in fantasy is that he had punched in all those short yardage carries as a rookie.
So that is the reports, and that's kind of when I'm drafting with Zach. Zach's a Washington Commanders fan from the Washington area, so he gets dibs. Sometimes I'm picking my guys, but I do think that there has been a lot of reports around the goal line element of it. The one problem that I have with Washington is I don't know how often they're going to be down around the goal line to be able to make that work. But when we're into this late area, there's a lot worse options. But when I'm looking at some of the other options in this particular range that I would be interested in, you mentioned McKinnon. We're looking at, may not have a big workload, but may have more high value touches than somebody like Brian Robinson could have. The other one there that you touched on is Eno Benjamin, who, again, high-powered offense. That's my concern with the Brian Robinson pick. I do think that there's going to be a lot to split. The other part is J.D. McKissick is back there, almost went to the Bills for a couple of hours and is back with Washington. So there's a lot of ways that he could get squeezed out. And if we're relying on just the goal line work, that could cause a little bit of trouble for us. Do you think that's going to be the main issue there, is the actual work to go around in that offense and how valuable it actually ends up being? Because I think that Washington's probably going to be one of the bottom 5 teams in the NFL this year.
The other issue, I think, is talent, and people are very split on Brian Robinson. Some analysts actually liking him quite a bit. But one of the issues there, and saying that he actually is better than someone like Najee Harris, the flip side of that is that he didn't have any success at really breaking into the Alabama running back pecking order when the other stars were there. And those guys have been good, but not great at the NFL level. So if you're behind them, again, you're kind of a backup running back in all likelihood. That doesn't mean that it's impossible for him to emerge. But when you have both situational and talent questions, I think you probably have to go in a different direction until you're very, very late. I think that McKinnon or Benjamin are probably the moves here, unless you're thinking this is a good time to take a flyer on Zamir White.
No, I think we'll go with McKinnon at this particular point. The only thing that I would say with Benjamin is, based on week 17, we have Atlanta at Arizona, but I think the better play is to go with McKinnon there. Sean can take a deep sigh of relief. Sammy Watkins has gone off the board in that next pick, so relief there for Sean. Laviska Shenault, who you mentioned earlier, did go off the board one pick prior to that. So when we look at the targets that we have, there's limited options in these late rounds, Sean. The two that I think I would be trying to get, you mentioned Tyquan Thornton, I mentioned Romeo Dubs or Dubs. I believe it's dubs. We're still, it does from each report I hear, it kind of varies from time to time. But is there any other late round options here that you're very, very interested in or hoping that they might be able to get back to us? My hopeful scenario is that we get both of those guys. But
well, Hassan Haskins is a running back who, similar to some of these guys we've talked about, and yet a less congested backfield. And based on his performance last year for Michigan, where he really carries this team farther than they've been in a while, I think that you've got to be, in many ways, more enthusiastic about his talent level, or at least putting him in the same basic tier as some of these bigger names, to where I'm not sure that we wouldn't want to consider him. Now, the situation on this team is that we have Derrick Henry, and so it'd really only be in the 20th round. You're not looking necessarily to handcuff, but if you do handcuff it, you need to be a very inexpensive handcuff. And again, you go through and you can look in the Stack Explorer and see that while there are some disadvantages to handcuffing, that the number 1 and number 2 backs together has historically been a fine approach to take. I think the prices and your overall team construction are going to dictate kind of how you want to do that. Again, there's a big difference between a 20th round pick and, say, drafting Dalvin Cook and then trying to take Alexander Mattison, in part because I'm not convinced Madison is necessarily even going to be the backup, but there are fairly significant differences there. D'Ernest Johnson, someone that we would have to look at if he or Kareem Hunt were involved in a trade. Basically both of them become very intriguing pieces at that juncture. Colm, you've been talking about Jimmy Garoppolo, but I did add Geno Smith and Malik Willis into the queue, thinking in terms of round 20. And Willis has been portrayed as a pure red shirt this season, and yet I just think we're way too early in the offseason to feel any kind of confidence in that type of report. If the light bulb goes on, things could change in a real hurry. We joked earlier about Geno being the backup because the Seahawks are tanking, but one of those two guys in all likelihood will be the starter for the Seahawks. So that would be a way to get a little bit more QB firepower if you're not confident in the players that we already have. I think it is Romeo Doubs. You were mentioning the pronunciation elements there. I guess I'm not looking to have more Packers exposure once we have Christian Watson. I think you got to sort of split those guys up, whether it's Watson, Watkins, Doubs. Tyquan Thornton would probably be my guy at wide receiver if we make another selection at that position. Because we waited on the second QB, and because we did go wide receiver heavy after those first two running back picks of Henry and Hall, we can probably afford to be a little bit lighter on total numbers of wide receiver. I don't know that we have to force it here if we don't think the value is there.
I don't think we have to force it. The other one, Shawn, that's there as a wide receiver, did get traded this offseason, is Brian Edwards, who you could pair into that Atlanta side of things as well. Any hope for Brian Edwards and his young career to spring forward here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's still hope. These guys are going to continue competing. But I would probably prefer to take some kind of wild shot at Terrace Marshall to get that Panthers flavor in there. I've been told that Brian Edwards is beloved by the Falcons and that they're going to, try and force him some touches. From what we have seen with a likely decline in quarterback play, it's difficult to figure out how he would be involved in what, should be a middle of the road offense and has two likely superstars in front of him.
Well, that sounds like a no on the option to draft Brian Edwards at this pick. You mentioned a 20th round pick for Thornton. I would be happy to take Thornton here and to see how it plays out then first in the 20th round, because based on how we've gone at wide receiver, I don't think we want to miss out on him. And then you did mention Geno Smith, Malik Willis as potential options. Let's see how it goes over these next couple of picks. But based on Malik Willis went in that next pick on us, it would be nice to have one more quarterback on this roster. But I think at the moment with we have Justin Jefferson, we have T. Higgins, Devontae Smith, Drake London, Sky Moore, Christian Watson, and Tyquan Thornton. But we're hoping those rookies hit, but we're very heavily invested in the rookies. So I think another wide receiver probably for the depth helps us out a little bit more. So we have 2, 4, 6, we have 7 wide receivers. Are you happy with the 7 that we have to not take a flyer here in this last pick?
I am. I don't know that there's anybody who really helps. Again, we could take Marshall now that they have a legitimate quarterback in position. It becomes much more interesting. And then the connection there with Mayfield, we've heard some just very slight murmurings that Marshall might be turning a little bit of a corner. Outside of him, I don't know that there is a player that moves the needle much at all. You could obviously go with AJ Green and try and benefit from the early season. You could go with James Washington and try and benefit from the early season with Gallup being out and the opportunity to show that he's more than what he was with Pittsburgh. In Pittsburgh, he was buried behind some guys who were quite good starters. That would be an option there. But yeah, we're into this sort of odd space column where after Zamir White went, I don't know that there is a running back either that we would feel like we have to have. Pierre Strong, I think the really deep option who appeals to me, but it's going to take a real long shot for him to come into value. Mark Ingram, someone who is playable in a situation where Abram Smith is probably the other running back in the mix to fill in for Alvin Kamara if Kamara has a 6-game suspension or a 4-game suspension that he serves to start or sometime in the middle of the season. We don't know an exact timeline or numbers on that yet. Ingram, at his current talent level and in the context of an offense that likely won't be high scoring, especially when Alvin Kamara is out, that is maybe a safer type of pick than we usually make, perhaps not that appealing. So we're kind of in this dynamic here where, we could go with Dubs, we could go with Edwards, we could go with Marshall, we could go with the handcuff. We don't like to make that kind of compromise pick unless we're really pushed into it. Drew Lock, Geno Smith, both still available.
Yeah, it feels like that might be the way to go. So we're between Terrence Marshall. We could have been between Brian Edwards, but that's not happening today. Or Romeo Dubs, but we're going to. I think Sean. I think we've talked about it. We've had a little bit of fun with it, but I think we could put our bet on Geno Smith here because there is that risk with Marcus Mariota that he may lose the role either early in the season, before the season, or throughout the season. I think having Geno there may give us just a little bit of insurance at the quarterback position. So for me, it's between him and Terrence Marshall. And with Robbie Anderson there and with with the Christian McCaffrey, and then obviously you add in DJ Moore as well. I don't know what we're going to get from Marshall, who really didn't show us anything last year.
And Geno Smith, well, it feels silly to be taking him in the last round in a lot of these drafts. The player who does start for the Seattle Seahawks is going to have DK Metcalf, is going to have Tyler Lockett. I think it makes a big difference that they're going to have Noah Fant. That adds a third elite talent when in the past, not having the depth has allowed defenses to play a variety of, I wouldn't say gimmick coverages, but to go out and take away these 2 stars when you don't have the threat to the other players. In many of the seasons, you didn't have a healthy running back who was dynamic enough to make the defense really care about what you did there. The Seahawks want to emphasize the run, but when they didn't have Rashad Penny available, and you're talking about last season, Chris Carson, he gets injured. You have Alex Collins and true backups in there. So again, not players who are going to dictate any type of defensive response. This year you have Rashad Penny maybe emerging as one of the best backs in the NFL, and then Ken Walker, the second best running back in this draft class. the firepower surrounding the QB is going to be better than people think. And even though the quarterback is likely to be a laughing stock, Geno played okay last season when he was in there. The team has tried to craft this narrative that they're pointing to 2023, but you get in there with the players and the coaches and the competitiveness. I mean, this is a team that's going to fight. And so if you have the starting quarterback there in round 20, I think you have to take that, because on an individual game basis, you never know when it could come into play. The other players we were looking at, and maybe a different order would have worked better. Maybe if we had saved Tyquan Thornton for the last pick, maybe we could have gone with a Greg Dulcich and saved a player for a later pick. But the order that we did decide to go in here did work out for a QB in round 20. And I think that even though Drew Lock may be the guy, I like having that fourth QB.
Yeah, I think I feel a little bit better with the Mariota element to it. We're going for those reclamation projects. Sean, a quarterback. We have Baker Mayfield, Marcus Mariota, and Geno Smith. You said that Jimmy Garoppolo was going to go in the 20th round. What you meant to say was Geno Smith was going to go in the 20th round. Jimmy Garoppolo wasn't going to get traded, so Geno Smith would still be the right quarterback to pair with. No offense. So we got there in the end. We've gone from me thinking about rooting for Jimmy Garoppolo to go to the Seahawks to now actively not wanting that to happen, so Geno Smith can be the starter all season long for Seattle. But Sean, we finish up with our full roster. We'll give it a little bit of a rundown here. So we have Geno Smith, Marcus Mariota, Jalen Hurts, Baker Mayfield, Derrick Henry, Jarrett McKinnon, Chris Evans, Breece Hall, Isaiah Spiller, Terrion Davis-Price, Christian Watson, Drake London, Sky Moore, Tyquan Thornton, T. Higgins, Justin Jefferson, Devontae Smith, Trey McBride, Noah Fant, and TJ Hawkinson. This team, like the majority of our team, Sean, really and truly built on youth, built on all players nearly in their first 3 seasons in the NFL in one way or the other, and a lot of those guys in their first season as rookies. So